I think I'll start the lecture now. Welcome everyone. I'm Elise, and this lecture is on feminist international relations. I don't really care when people ask questions, so you can ask during, ask after. It doesn't really matter to me. But yeah. So, I'll start now. So first, I think to get a good idea of what feminist international relations is, it's good to have an idea of what general IR theory is kind of about. So at its first a basic definition of international relations is kind of just like foreign affairs or relations among countries. It's pretty self-explanatory. And the three main branches that people tend to bring into the discussion is realism, liberalism, and constructivism. Realism, in my opinion, is one of the most important to understand when you're debating feminist IR, because feminist IR pretty much puts itself in opposition with realism, and it finds issues with realism. So all of these theories also tend to kind of draw from people's ideas of human nature, and then they extend that to the international field and to the way that countries act with one another. So in terms of realism, they view international relations as an inherently competitive field where different countries are in competition with one another for power. And this view of human nature is very Hobbesian, and it's all about egocentrism, self-centeredness, not exactly selfishness, but just that the self is the primary starting point, and it is what all countries are going to be caring about first and foremost. Additionally, briefly, there's four main assumptions that underlie realist IR. First is that states are the most important actor, so that would mean, in contrast to institutions, individuals, people, the state in the international field is the most important actor. Second, they say that the international system is anarchic. So by that they mean there's no higher governing body. And this second principle has a lot of implications for how they view dealing with issues. So they tend to not view trade agreements, other types of agreements, as very productive or helpful because there's no higher governing body to enforce it. So if they were seeing some sort of international issue, they probably wouldn't want to cooperate by means of a trade deal or another type of deal. They'd probably want to use force or other means of kind of showing their dominance to try and fix the issue. The third assumption is that all states within the system are unitary rational actors, and by that they mean that they pursue what is in their self-interest, and they believe that every state is going to be acting in that same manner. And lastly, they think that the primary concern of the state is survival, so they're going to do whatever it takes to survive as a state. A moment. There we go. Okay, next is liberalism. And liberalism is also a lot different than realism. It's about mutual cooperation for better world outcomes, and it's not, so instead of viewing the world as a dog-eat-dog world where every state is for themselves, they believe that by cooperation, everyone will be better off. So they kind of view things as the world as a place of abundance. So things like trade agreements they would view as very positive because it would help both countries be better off. They also focus a lot on institutions, so the use of NGOs and stuff. They view as important to set having norms that the international system can agree upon, even though there isn't some higher body that's forcing them to follow these norms or rules. And hand in hand with that, they're really big on democracy, diplomacy, and they care about that and believe that's a lot more important than the use of physical force or war. So they see, in terms of solving issues, they would be very slow to using force to solve international issues. Okay, and last is constructivism. This one, I think is less important to understand, but it's just kind of about how the world is what you make it to be, and reality is socially constructed. So instead of viewing the world as a place that's inherently competitive and people are for themselves, or viewing it as like a place where everyone wants to like have cooperation for the greater good, they just say the way that like you act is going to create the world. And then they also kind of talk about how we assign meaning to a lot of concepts, and that meaning isn't inherently there. So things like sovereignty, people care about the sovereignty of their nation because they assign meaning to it, not because it inherently has meaning. Okay, now moving to FemIR, what the lecture's actually about. So this kind of came into popularity in the 1990s, and it's also mostly a critique of realism. And as a critique of realism, it does contain elements of both liberalism and constructivism, and like the constructivist theory, but that isn't, the main point isn't to further these theories, but it's more to show the importance of like gender and the ideas of masculinity and femininity on the international sphere, and how that influences how states are like making decisions and doing things. They also view individuals as like important actors, where realism only views like states as the primary and like basically the only important actor when thinking about international relations. FemIR like kind of draws upon like this idea of like the personal is political, which is like a really like famous idea in all of feminism, and how like the roles that women and men and like masculinities and feminities assume in private life is going to kind of extend to how states interact in the international sphere. Kind of along with that, the traditional paradigms of IR, like realism mostly, they believe that that creates dichotomies of masculinities and feminities, which kind of go into how they act. So they view men as the aggressors or protectors of women, whereas women are the carers or the ones that need to be protected. So women are portrayed as those taking care of the injured, or anti-war protesters, and men are the people who are men are the people that are basically just like the ones perpetrating the like violence, kind of, or creating the like aggression. And that kind of also goes in line with like what people say in terms of like protecting the old, sick, women, and children. Yeah. I also have some cards to read. Okay, so these are like cards that I've taken from cases that I've read, or like cards I've seen. So this is like debate evidence that people have used in round, and kind of I think demonstrates the ideas in FemIR. So first, a big idea is that realist IR privileges the masculine. So it privileges things like values and characteristics that people tend to ascribe to like that are masculine. So this comes from author Blanchard 12, and it says realism stresses rationality, strength, power, autonomy, and independence, qualities as associated with foreign policy and military affairs as they are with masculinity, while realists take power as the coercive means by which states obtain security at the expense of other states. So here it kind of talks about how things like rationality, strength, power, autonomy, all of these are like masculine traits that are seen as like good qualities for men to have. And so when states go into the international arena and they're making decisions, they want to make, in terms of the realist paradigm, they're making decisions that align with these masculine characteristics. And they're probably not going to make decisions that align with more like feminine characteristics or feminine like perceived qualities. This is another card, and this talks about how realism kind of creates its own self-fulfilling prophecy. So a big part of realism is kind of just stating, actually I'm going to read it first. This is like an author, Runyan and Patterson. It says, realism maintains dominance by its very ability to define and thus create what is real. It is designed not for knowledge and cognition, but for acknowledgement and recognition. Realism's four known answers arise from its assumption about the way the world is divided: inside, outside, strong, weak, rich, poor, peace, war, men, women. It is unable to deliver the very things it says it's all about: security, power, and sovereignty, or more positively, safety, efficacy, and self-determination. So a big part of this is saying that, so realism kind of is making claims about the way the world is. Like, they say the world is a competition for resources. It's a competition for power. And so because of that, we have to use these like masculine qualities, like aggression, autonomy, all of these things to create a better world. But what FemIR is saying is that the reason that this keeps on happening, the reason why people are aggressive, is because we're seeing the world as it is. So the realism is painting the world as a certain way and claiming that that's just what is real, and then acting on it, and therefore creating its own prophecy in the process. And this kind of also shows a way in which FemIR is similar to constructivism, in that they kind of view that if you take actions or view the world differently, then you can kind of create a different end product. Yeah, now this is kind of an example that is also taken from a card to kind of explain that. So in one of this card, it's the authors are Ustjang and Atmaka. They use the example of the Cold War to demonstrate like the cyclical nature of hegemony. So like in the Cold War, the US tried to show a lot of dominance in its unipolarity, and like it was kind of a competition between nations to show that they were like first to do things. And additionally, in the Cold War, like the US painted other countries as like communist and dangerous, and then they used that excuse of like this threat of national security to take more aggressive actions. But as we know, like that didn't create world peace. Like that didn't create necessarily a more like cooperative or peaceful world in the end. And because of this, it kind of showed that it's not it's a cycle that can't end. It's like a cycle that will forever continue. And if countries always have this mindset, then they're going to constantly have to show aggression and then create more issues. Okay, there's one more card. This one is kind of, in my opinion, what can be used as like a solution card in debate rounds. So a lot of times in a critique on the negative, you'd use it as like the alternative card, or on the affirmative, it's kind of, you can kind of show to describe what FemIR sees the world as, or sees a good solution as. And to the author, Cynthia Enlow, she sees embracing the fragility and vulnerability of nations as very important to that. So she says, the attempt to deny its inevitability is what has led to development of weapons of mass destruction as deterrence. It's led to the US partnerships with oppressive regimes. If we acknowledge the impossibility of making ourselves invulnerable, we would have policies that fostered goodwill and interdependence. So there's kind of two important things to that. First is that she brings up how if you, by embracing the inherent vulnerability in like your nation, like you can never forever be the like hegemonic nation state. You can never be perfectly safe. Then you're going to take less actions that create the danger in the first place. So she says like it led to develop a weapons of mass destruction as deterrence, when obviously we know now that we have the presence of like big weapons of mass destruction, that's obviously creating just a more unsafe world in the long run, and now we're scared of those as well. So we kind of create our problems by believing that we can be completely safe. And then she also talks about, she says like we would have policies that foster goodwill and interdependence, and I think that's important to note because it's definitely similar in line with liberalism, in that she believes that some form of cooperation between nations will be better than like to each their own mentality. Okay, now moving on to debate applications. I think what's really great about this, about FemIR, is that it's really perfect to use in debate, and it can be applied against a lot of different cases, especially policy type cases that people run. So kind of standard and like really good links to use are links to security. Like if someone's talking about needing to protect the national security of the US, and therefore they need to like do the AF or do the plan or whatever. Talking about hegemony, ideas of like hegemonic masculinity, economic coercion. So like even if it's not a military aggression that one one person is asking about, if they kind of are trying to use the economy or like economic means to coerce other nations. That can also be a link. Military adventurism and just the rhetoric of a case. If they keep on talking about, like if the AF or the neg keeps on talking about like how one nation is extremely powerful, like there's going to be a great power war if we don't do something, and then they keep on using that rhetoric, then that rhetoric is a link in itself. Yeah. A personal case example where I used FemIR was a topic a couple years ago, and it said the United States ought not provide military aid to authoritarian regimes, and I used FemIR as like a KAF, so I used it as like a critique of the logic of necessarily using military force as a method of conflict resolution. So saying that the logic of providing military aid to authoritarian regimes or countries in general, that's not a good way to like create a solution, and we shouldn't jump to that first, kind of. And then as an extension of that, in my case, I also talked a lot about kind of like notions of terrorism and how the belief of like foreign terrorism was an excuse to provide further military weapons to like authoritarian regimes in this instance, and how like perceiving the threat of terrorism in that instance was just another excuse to add more force to the equation. Okay, I'll just also go over a couple of criticisms of FemIR, which are both criticisms of the theory in itself and have been used, I think, in debate. So I think a big one first is that it can be seen as a Western theory. So by that, meaning like it's kind of similar to like the idea of like white feminism. It doesn't apply to less developed countries. And I think a good response to this is that FemIR is also extremely tied up with ideas of colonialism, and they argue that colonialism, which FemIR would argue is a byproduct of this like masculine need to assert our dominance over other countries, can actually be really devastating, and it creates what they call like hierarchies of masculinities and feminities that extend just beyond like the dichotomy of like man, woman, men, women. So there's a lot of people who have been hurt by these dichotomies. So first is Black men are portrayed as aggressors, and they're also sexualized. Also, in international relations, Asian men have been seen as more effeminate, like they don't meet what the traditional like man, I guess, should be in terms of like international relations, and therefore they're seen as weak. Asian women have also been perceived as sexual objects, and as like an empirical example of this, Nazi Germany would use ideals of manliness to justify genocide of Jewish men. So when Jewish men were portrayed as the antithesis of German manliness, these like ideas of the masculine and feminine were then used as a justification for aggression and the genocide of Jewish people. Another criticism is this idea of it being just a women's issue, but I think a good response is that it affects all genders, because it talks not just about men and women, but the idea of masculinity and femininity. So having the perfect conception of what a man is would mean that any men who don't adhere to this, like the perfect masculine person, are also going to be seen as inferior. So it really just affects anyone who can't perfectly fit within the mold of masculine and feminine. Yeah, that's all. Any questions? Okay. Carissa, thoughts? Am I good?
I was just waiting.
I can just end it if everyone's good and it was like understandable. But
I feel like maybe going back on, let's see, Did everyone understand like the application of the cards and kind of like how you use the text in a debate round? Maybe do you have any like specific um actually okay, so if someone asks you as an opponent in the round like how does like is there an example of this theory like or like the alt for example working and what did you read as the alt or like the role of the ballot?
Yeah, so I talked about like the Enlo card, which is kind of embracing like vulnerability. So first, I think like a big part of like critiques and FemIR being a critique is that they don't necessarily bring up like a concrete way of like a course of action because they're not trying to introduce like a plan to solve it. So it is kind of like a mindset or a theory of looking at other theories. But I would say if you want to make it more concrete, then you can look to the like kind of overlaps that FemIR does have with constructivism and liberalism. So first constructivism, like saying if FemIR by acknowledging that like we create the world that we see by like seeing the world differently or creating different action to create a different world, then we can kind of reproduce the reality that we want and not just view it as like a land of like complete competition that you have to use aggression to kind of win. And then hand in hand with that, like liberalism talks more about like codependence and cooperation for a better world. So you could, if you wanted to make it more like plan or like advocate for something concrete, then you could kind of bring in like trade agreements, different ways that states cooperate to get to like a mutual goal of theirs. Yeah, okay. Um, yeah, I think I'm.
I have one more thing.
Okay, go
In like
ahead.
in like cross-ex, I have a hard time like defending my alt honestly because I have a hard time like seeing like how this leads to like concrete action. Is there a way to think about it as like you don't need to have like concrete I don't know, cause like I guess like during cross-ex, what was kind of your like response to like being pressed on like what exactly it does?
Oh yeah. I feel like that kind of goes into this big like policy versus like K arena. So like if you're running critique, normally you're not talking about like the concrete steps that your plan would do, but you'd probably like push back on the idea that like talking about policy, especially talking about policy in a way that you would see as destructive, you know, like in a realist like paradigm of like there's going to be a great power war, you have to like take this action. You'd see like that as not being a productive way of like learning anything in debate. So if you have like an alternative like the FemIR one, then you'd say that first like your rhetoric of like embracing the vulnerability that states and people have is like a prerequisite to coming up with policies that are actually going to like foster the like goodwill and like the like betterment of the world in general. Um, and then there's just like, yeah, yeah. I guess there's a lot of more specific kind of ways to do that as well, but um, I'd say that's like a main one to use. You're kind of just like bringing up representations as being more important than like your representations in debate being more important than the discussion of specific policy plans. Yeah. Okay then. Thanks for coming. Stop recording. Bye.